I was born during the year 1818 in Tuckahoe, 12 miles from Easton in Talbot County, Maryland. My mother, Harriet Bailey, gave me the name Frederick Augustus Washington Bailey. I never saw my mother to know her as such more than 4 or 5 times in my life, and each of those times was very short in duration. My mother was a field hand, and a whipping was the penalty for not being in the field at sunrise. She was hired by Mr. Stewart, who lived 12 miles from my home. She made her journeys to see me in the night, traveling the whole distance on foot after the performance of a day's work. She would lie down with me and get me to sleep, but long before I waked, she was gone. The last time I recall seeing her, she gave me the sweet cake in the shape of a heart with a rich, dark ring glazed around the edge of it. I was victorious and well off for the moment, prouder on my mother's knee than a king upon his throne. But my triumph was short. I dropped off to sleep and waked in the morning only to find my mother gone. I only had flickering memories of her nighttime visits and a vague notion that she resembled the drawing of an Egyptian pharaoh I found in a book. I often recur to it with something of the feelings which I suppose others experience when looking upon the likeness of their own dear departed ones. Death soon ended what little we could have while she lived, and with it, her hardships and suffering. She died when I was about 7 years old on one of my master's farms near Lee's Mill. I was not allowed to be present during her illness, at her death, or at her burial. She was gone long before I knew anything about it. Never having enjoyed to any considerable extent her soothing presence, her tender and watchful care, I received the tidings of her death with much the same emotions I should have probably felt at the death of a stranger. I learned after my mother's death that she could read, and that she was the only one of all the slaves and colored people in Tuckahoe who enjoyed that advantage. How she acquired that knowledge, I know not, for Tuckahoe is the last place in the world where she would be apt to find facilities for learning. That a field hand should learn to read in any slave state is remarkable, but the achievement of my mother, considering the place, was very extraordinary, and in view of that fact, I am quite willing and even happy to attribute any love of letters I possess, any for which I've got, not to my admitted Anglo-Saxon paternity, but to the native genius of my sable, unprotected, and uncultivated mother, a woman who belonged to a race whose mental endowments it is, at present, fashionable to hold in disparagement and contempt. In my mother's absence, I was raised by my grandmother Betsy, who lived in a log cabin apart from the slave quarters on Anthony Holmes Hill Farm. The old cabin, with its rail floor and rail bedsteads upstairs, and its clay floor downstairs, and its dirt chimney and windowless sides, and that more curious piece of workmanship of all the rest, the ladder stairway, and the hole dug in front of the fireplace, beneath which Grandmammy placed the sweet potatoes to keep them from the frost, was my home. The only home I ever had, and I loved it, and all connected with it. Grandmother Betsy was exceptional, a figure of great strength. She was married to Isaac Bailey, my grandfather, a free man and a sawyer. She enjoyed substantial autonomy relative to her enslaved neighbors, and was admired throughout the Tuckahoe area for her remarkable skills. I have known her to be in the water waist deep for hours, seine hauling. She was a gardener as well as a fisherwoman, and remarkable for her success in keeping seedling sweet potatoes through the months of winter, and easily got the reputation of being born to good luck. During planting time, Grandmother Betsy was sent for in all directions, simply to place the seedling potatoes in the hills or drills. Superstition had it that her touch was needed to make them grow. This reputation was full of advantage to her children and her grandchildren, for a good crop brought her a share of the harvest.
Dixon Preston, in Young Frederick Douglass, The Maryland Years, wrote, Frederick's memories of the cabin and his life there were idyllic. He recalled it as a wild and free existence, totally unlike anything he would ever experience after he grew old enough to grasp the implications of what it meant to be a slave. Douglass spent countless carefree hours watching the wagons come and go as farmers brought corn to be ground into meal, gazing with fascination at the turning of the ponderous wheel, feeling the tug of sunfish as they nibbled at the worms he used as bait on the bent pin and tow thread fishing line Grandmama Betsy rigged up for him. It was a happy time, one he would remember always as the most golden period of his life. He was free as a bird. He could do anything he liked, gallop like a horse, grunt back at the pigs, flap his arms in imitation of the barnyard rooster. He had plenty of playmates, for the cabin was always overflowing with children. His Uncle Henry, who was 2 years younger than he was, cousins Mary, Isaac, Steve, and Henry, who were all about his own age. As for Frederick, he was, in his own words, a spirited, joyous, uproarious, and happy boy.
As I grew larger and older, I learned by degrees the sad fact that the little hut and the lot on which it stood belonged not to my dear old grandparents, but to some person who lived a great distance off and who was called by grandmother Old Master. I was told this Old Master, whose name seemed ever to be mentioned with fear and shuddering, only allowed children to live with grandmother for a limited time. The liability to be separated from grandmother, never to see her again, haunted me. When the time of my departure was decided upon, my grandmother, knowing my fears and in pity for them, kindly kept me ignorant of the dreaded event about to transpire. Up to the morning, a beautiful summer morning, when we were to start, and indeed, during the whole journey, a journey which, child as I was, I remember as if it were yesterday. She kept the sad fact hidden from me the whole time. Advanced in years as she was, as was evident from the more than one gray hair which peeped from between the ample and graceful folds of her newly and smoothly ironed bandana turban. Grandmother was yet a woman of power and spirit. She was remarkably straight in figure, elastic and muscular in movement. I seemed hardly to be a burden to her. She would have toted me further, but I felt myself too much a man to allow it. Yet while I walked, I was not independent of her. She often found me holding her skirts, lest something should come out of the woods and eat me up. Several old logs and stumps imposed upon me, and got themselves taken for enormous animals. I could plainly see their legs, ears, eyes, and teeth only as such because of the point from which they were seen. As the day advanced, the heat increased, and it was not until the afternoon when we reached the much dreaded end of the journey. Here, I found myself in the midst of a group of children of all sizes and of many colors, black, brown, copper-colored, and nearly white. I had not seen so many children before. As a newcomer, I was an object of special interest. After all the laughter and yelling around me, and all the playing of wild tricks, they asked me to go out and play with them. This I refused to do. Grandmama looked sad, and I could not help feeling that our being there boded no good for me. She was soon to lose another object of affection, as she had lost many before. Affectionately patting me on the head, she told me to be a good boy and to go out and play with the children. "They are kin to you," she said. "Go play with them." She pointed out to me my brother Perry, my sisters Sarah and Eliza. I had never seen them before, and though I had sometimes heard of them, I felt a curious interest in them. I really did not understand what they were to me or I to them. Brothers and sisters they were by blood, but slavery made us strangers. They were already initiated into the mysteries of old master's domicile, and they seemed to look upon me with a certain degree of compassion. I really wanted to play with them and their children. Play, however, I did not, but stood with my back against the wall, witnessing the playing of the others. At last, while standing there, one of the children, who had been in the kitchen, ran up to me in a sort of roguish glee, exclaiming, "Fed, Grandmama gone." I could not believe it, yet, fearing the worst, I ran into the kitchen to see for myself, and lo, she was indeed gone, and was now far away and clean out of sight. Almost heartbroken at the discovery, I fell upon the ground and wept a boy's bitter tears, refusing to be comforted. My brother gave me peaches and pears to quiet me, but I promptly threw them to the ground. I had never been deceived before, and something of resentment at this mingled with my grief at parting with my grandmother. I know not where, but I suppose I sobbed myself to sleep, and its balm was never more welcome to any wounded soul than mine, and I wish to give a faithful history of my experience in slavery. I cannot withhold a circumstance which at the time affected me so deeply, and which I still remember so vividly. Besides, this was my first introduction to the realities of the slave system. While I lived on the Colonel Lloyd's plantation, I was not old enough to work in the field, and there being little else than field work to do, I had a great deal of leisure time. The most I had to do was drive up the cows at the evening, keep the fowls out of the garden, keep the front yard clean, and run errands for old master's daughter, Miss Lucretia Auld. The most of my leisure time I spent in helping Master Daniel Lloyd in finding his birds after he had shot them. My connection with Master Daniel was of some advantage to me. He became quite attached to me and was sort of a protector of me. He would not allow the older boys to impose upon me and would divide his cakes with me. I was seldom whipped by my old master and suffered little from anything else than hunger and cold. I suffered from hunger, but much more from cold. In the hottest summer and coldest winter, I was kept almost naked. No shoes, no stockings, no jacket, no trousers, nothing on but a coarse tow linen shirt, reaching only to my knees. I had no bed. The coldest nights, I used to steal a bag which was used for carrying corn to the mill. I would crawl into this bag and sleep on the cold, damp clay floor, with my head and feet out. My feet have been so cracked with the frost that the pen with which I am writing might be laid in the gashes. Our food was coarse cornmeal boiled. This was called mush. It was put into a large wooden tray or trough and set down upon the ground. The children were then called like so many pigs, and like so many pigs, they would come and devour the mush, some with oyster shells, some with pieces of shingle, some with naked hands, and none with spoons. He that ate the fastest got most. He that was strongest secured his place, and few left the trough satisfied. I spent 2 years of childhood on this plantation, and probably was between 7 and 8 years old when I left. I left with joy. I shall never forget the ecstasy with which I received the intelligence that my old master, Anthony, had determined to let me go to Baltimore to live with Mr. Hugh Auld, brother to my old master's son-in-law, Captain Thomas Auld. I received this information about 3 days before my departure. They were the happiest days I ever enjoyed. I spent the most part of these 3 days in the creek and preparing myself for the departure. Miss Lucretia had told me I must get all the dead skin off my feet and knees before I could go. Besides, she was going to give me a pair of trousers which I should not put on unless I got all the dirt off of me. I thought owning a pair of trousers was great indeed. I look upon my departure from Colonel Lloyd's plantation as one of the most interesting events of my life. I regarded myself as being somewhat remarkable. There were those younger, those older, and those of the same age. I was chosen from among them all, and was the first, last, and only choice. We sailed out of the Miles River for Baltimore on a Saturday morning. On setting sail, I walked aft and gave to Colonel Lloyd's plantation what I hoped would be the last look. I then placed myself in what was in the distance. In the afternoon, we reached Annapolis. It was the first large town I had ever seen. We arrived in Baltimore early on Sunday morning, landing at Smith's Wharf. Mr. and Mrs. Auld were both at home and met me at the door with their little son Thomas. Here, I saw what I had never seen before. It was a white face beaming with the most kindly emotions. It was the face of my new mistress, Sophia Auld. I wish I could describe the rapture that flashed through my soul as I beheld it. Little Thomas was told there was Freddie, and I was told to take care of little Thomas. And thus I entered upon the duties with the most cheering prospect ahead. Soon after, she kindly commenced to teach me the ABC. After I learned this, she assisted me in learning to spell words of 3 or 4 letters. Just at the point of my progress, Mr. Auld found out what was going on, and at once forbade Mrs. Auld to instruct me further, telling her, among other things, that it was unlawful, as well as unsafe, to teach a slave to read. The very manner with which he spoke, and strove to impress his wife the evil consequences of giving me instruction, served to convince me that he was deeply sensible of the truths he was uttering. It gave me the best assurance that I might rely with the utmost confidence on the results which, he said, would flow from teaching me to read. What he most dreaded, that I most desired. What he loved the most, that I most hated. That which to him was a great evil, to be carefully shunned, was to me a great good, to be diligently sought. And the argument which he so warmly urged against my learning to read, only served to inspire me with a desire and determination to learn. In learning to read, I owe almost as much to the bitter opposition of my master as to the kindly aid of my mistress. I lived in Master Hugh's family about 7 years. During this time, I succeeded in learning to read and write. Mistress, in teaching me the alphabet, had given me the inch, and no precaution could prevent me from taking the L. I converted little white boys I met on the street into teachers. With their kindly aid, obtained at different times and in different places, I finally succeeded in learning to read. I was about 12 years old, and the thought of being a slave for life began to bear heavily upon my heart. Just about that time, I got a hold of a book entitled The Columbian Orator. Every opportunity I got, I found in it a dialogue between master and slave. In a very short time after I went to live in Baltimore, my old master's youngest son, Richard, died. And in about 3 years and 6 months after his death, my old master, Captain Anthony, died, leaving only his son, Andrew, and his daughter, Lucretia, to share his estate. I was immediately sent for to be valued with the other property, that it might be equally divided between Miss Lucretia and Master Andrew. And after a sail of about 24 hours, I found myself near the place of my birth. I had now been absent from it almost, if not quite, 5 years. Very soon after my return to Baltimore, my mistress, Lucretia, died, and in a very short time after her death, Master Andrew died. Now all the property of my old master, slaves included, was in the hands of strangers. In about 2 years after the death of Miss Lucretia, Master Thomas married his second wife, the eldest daughter of Mr. William Hamilton. Master now lived in St. Michael's. Not long after his marriage, a misunderstanding took place between himself and Master Hugh, and as a means of punishing his brother, he took me from him to live with himself at St. Michael's. It was more than 7 years since I had lived with him in the family of Old Master on Colonel Lloyd's property. We were now almost strangers to each other. He was to me a new master, and I to him a new slave. I was ignorant of his temper and disposition. He was equally of mine. I equated his wife not less than with himself. They were well matched, both being equally mean and cruel. I now was made to feel the painful gnawing of hunger, something which I had not experienced before since I left Colonel Lloyd's plantation. A great many times have we poor creatures been nearly perishing with hunger, when food in abundance lay moldering in the safe and smokehouse. My master and myself had quite a number of differences. He found me unsuitable to his purpose. My city life, he said, had very pernicious effects upon me. It had almost ruined me for every good purpose, and fitted me for everything which was bad. Master Thomas at length said he would stand it no longer. I had with him 9 months, during which he had given me a number of severe whippings, all to no good purpose. He resolved to put me out, to be broken, and, for his purpose, he lent me for 1 year to a man named Edward Covey. Mr. Covey had acquired a very high reputation for breaking young slaves, and his reputation was of immense value to him. It enabled him to get his farm tilled with much less expense to himself than he could have had it done without such a reputation. I had been at my new home but 1 week before Mr. Covey gave me a very severe whipping. During the first 6 months of that year, scarcely a week passed without his whipping me. My awkwardness was almost always his excuse for whipping me. We were often in the field from the first approach of day till its last lingering ray had left us, and at saving fodder time, midnight often caught us in the field binding blades. Covey would be with us. He would spend most of his afternoon in bed. He would come out fresh in the evening, ready to urge us on with his ample words and frequently with his whip. He was one of the few slaveholders who could and did work with hands. Sunday was my only leisure time. I spent this in a sort of beast-like stupor, between sleep and wake, under some large tree. At times I would rise up. A flash of energetic freedom would dart through my soul, accompanied with a faint beam of hope that flickered for a moment and then vanished. I was sometimes prompted to take my life and that of Covey, but was prevented by a combination of hope and fear. My sufferings on this plantation seem now like a dream rather than a stern reality. Our house stood within a few rods of the Chesapeake Bay, whose broad bosom was ever white with sails from every quarter of the habitable globe. Those beautiful vessels, robed in the purest white, so delightful to the eye of free men, were to me so many shrouded ghosts, to terrify and torment me with thoughts of my wretched condition. I have often, in the deep stillness of a summer Sabbath, stood all alone upon the lofty banks of that noble bay, and traced, with saddened heart and tearful eye, the countless number of sails moving off to the mighty ocean. The sight of these always affected me powerfully. My thoughts would compel utterance, and there, with no audience but the Almighty, I would pour out my soul's complaint in a rude way, with an apostrophe to the moving multiple of ships. You are loosed from your moorings, and are free. I am fast in my chains, and am a slave. You move merrily before the gentle gale, and I sadly before the bloody whip. You are freedom's swift-winged angels that fly round the world. I am confined in bands of iron. Oh, that I were free! Oh, that I were on one of your gallant decks, and under your protecting wing. Alas, betwixt me and you the turbid waters roll. Go on, go on! Oh, that I could also go! Could I but swim, if I could fly! Oh, why was I born a man of whom to make a brute? The glad ship is going, she hides in the dim distance. I am left in the hottest hell of unending slavery. Oh God, save me! God, deliver me! Let me be free! I had well die with ague as the fever. I have only one life to lose. I had as well be killed running as die standing. It cannot be that I shall live and die a slave. I will take to the water. This very bay shall bear me into freedom. My condition was much worse during the first 6 months of my stay with Mr. Covey than the last 6. The circumstances leading to the change in Mr. Covey's course toward me form an epoch in my humble history. You have seen how a man was made a slave. You shall see how a slave was made a man. On one of the hottest days of the month of August, 1834, Bill Smith, William Hughes, and a slave named Eli and myself were all engaged in fanning wheat. The work was simple, requiring strength rather than intellect, yet, to one entirely unused to this kind of work, it came very hard. About 3 o'clock of that day, I broke down. My strength failed me. I was seized with a violent aching of the head, attended with extreme dizziness. I trembled in every limb. Finding what was coming, I nerved myself up, feeling it would never do to stop work. I stood as long as I could stagger into the hopper with grain. When I could stand no longer, I fell, and felt as if held down by an immense weight. The fan, of course, stopped. Everyone had his own work to do, and no one could do the work of the other and have his own done at the same time. On hearing the fan stop, Mr. Covey immediately came to the spot where we were. I had by this time crawled away under the side of the post and rail fence by which the yard was enclosed, hoping to find relief by getting out of the sun. After looking at me a while, he asked me what was the matter. I told him as well as I could, for I scarce had the strength to speak. He then gave me a savage kick in the side and told me to get up. I tried to do so, but fell back in the attempt. He gave me another kick, and again he told me to rise. I again tried and succeeded in gaining my feet, but stooping to get the tub with which I was feeding the fan, I again staggered and fell. While down in this situation, Mr. Covey took up the hickory slat with which Hughes had been striking off the half-bushel measure, and with it gave me a heavy blow upon the head, making a large wound, and the blood ran freely. And with this again he told me to get up. I made no effort to comply, having now made up my mind to let him do his worst. In a short time after receiving this blow, Mr. Covey left me to my fate. I watched my chance while Covey was looking in the opposite direction and started for St. Michael's. I walked through the woods and blood was oozing from the wound on my head. I thought I should bleed to death. From the crown of my head to my feet, I was covered with blood. In this state, I appeared before my master. I told him all the circumstances. He asked me what I wanted. I told him, get me a new home, that Covey would surely kill me. Mr. Thomas ridiculed the idea that there was any danger of Mr. Covey killing me, and I belonged to Mr. Covey for a year. He gave me a very large dose of salts, telling me I might remain in St. Michael's that night, but that I must be off and back to Mr. Covey early in the morning. I reached Covey's about 9 o'clock. As I was getting over the fence, out ran Covey with the cowskin to give me another whipping. Before he could reach me, I succeeded in getting to the cornfield. It afforded me a means of hiding. He gave up the chase. I spent that day mostly in the woods. That night, I fell in with Sandy Jenkins. Sandy had a free wife who lived 4 miles from Covey's. I went home with him and talked the matter over. He told me I must go back to Covey. Sunday morning, I started for home, and upon entering the gate, out came Covey on his way to a church meeting. He spoke to me kindly, bade me drive the pigs from a lot nearby, and passed toward the church. All went well until Monday morning. I was called to go and feed the horses. I obeyed and was glad to obey. Mr. Covey entered the stable with a long rope. He caught hold of my legs and began to try to tie me up. At this moment, from whence came the spirit I don't know, I resolved to fight. He held on to me, and I to him. Mr. Covey soon called out to Hughes for help. Hughes came, and while Covey held me, attempting to tie my right hand, I gave him a heavy kick close to his ribs. This kick fairly sickened Hughes. Bill said his master hired him out to work, not to help whip me, so he left Covey and myself to fight on our own. We were at it for nearly 2 hours. Covey at length let me go, puffing and blowing at a great rate. I considered him as getting the entirely worst end of the bargain, as he had drawn no blood from me, and I had from him. The whole 6 months afterwards that I spent with Mr. Covey, he never laid the weight of his finger upon me in anger. The battle with Mr. Covey was the turning point in my career as a slave. It rekindled the few expiring embers of freedom and revived within me a sense of my own manhood. My term of actual service to Mr. Edward Covey ended on Christmas Day that year. On the first day of January 1835, I left Mr. Covey and went to live with Mr. William Freeland, who lived 3 miles from St. Michael's. I soon found Mr. Freeland a very different man from Mr. Covey. Though not rich, he was what would be called an educated Southern gentleman. He was exceedingly free from those degrading vices to which Mr. Covey was constantly addicted. Another advantage I gained from my new master was that he made no pretensions to or professions of religion, and this was, in my opinion, a truly great advantage. He, like Mr. Covey, gave us enough to eat, but unlike Mr. Covey, he gave us sufficient time to take up our meals. He worked us hard, but always between sunrise and sunset. Mr. Freeland was himself the owner of but 2 slaves. The rest of his hands he hired. I'll give Mr. Freeland the credit of being the best master I ever had till I became my own master. For the ease in which I passed the year, I was, however, indebted to the society of my fellow slaves. They were noble souls. They not only possessed loving hearts, but brave ones. I loved them with a love stronger than anything I have experienced since. I believe we would have died for each other. At the close of the year of 1835, Mr. Freeland again hired me of my master for the year 1836. But by this time, I began to want to live upon free land and away from Freeland. I was no longer content, therefore, to live with him or any other slaveholder. I began to prepare myself for a final struggle. I was fast approaching manhood, and year after year had passed, and I was still a slave. Those thoughts aroused me. I must do something. The plan we finally concluded upon was to get a large canoe, and upon the Saturday night paddle directly up the Chesapeake Bay. On our arrival at the head of the bay, it was our purpose to turn one canoe adrift and follow the guidance of the North Star till we got beyond the limits of Maryland. As time drew near for our departure, our anxiety became more and more intense. It was truly a matter of life or death with us. Our company consisted of Henry Harris, John Harris, Henry Bailey, Charles Roberts, and myself. Early that Saturday morning, we were spreading manure, and I was overwhelmed with an indescribable feeling. I turned and said to Sandy, "We are betrayed." I was never more certain of anything. The horn blew as usual, and we went up from the field to the house for breakfast at a large gate. I saw 4 white men on horses, with 2 colored men walking. After talking a while, Mr. Hamilton, Master William, Mr. Freeland, and the constables walked up to the house. We were tied and dragged 15 miles behind horses and then placed in an Easton jail. Mr. Freeland took Charles and the 2 Henrys and John out of jail, carried them home, and left me alone. A week later, Captain Auld, my master, came up and took me out with the intention of sending me to Alabama, but concluded to send me back to Baltimore to live with his brother Hugh and learn a trade. After an absence of about 3 years and a month, I was once more permitted to return to my old home in Baltimore. My master sent me away because there existed against me a very great prejudice in the community, and he feared I might be killed.
As a free man, a brilliant orator, author, statesman, and world-acclaimed abolitionist, Frederick Douglass returned to Talbot County June 1877 after a 41-year absence to meet Captain Thomas Auld. Auld spoke to Douglass in a quavering voice, calling him Marshal Douglass.
"I am Marshal Douglass in Washington. Here, let me be Fred."
They shook hands, and Auld, deeply moved, burst into tears.
The sight of him, the changes which time had wrought on him, his tremulous hands constantly shaking in motion, and all the circumstances of this condition affected me deeply. We both, however, got the better of feelings and conversed freely about the past.
"Frederick," Auld said, "I always knew you were too smart to be a slave, and had I been in your place, I should have done as you did."
"Captain Auld, I'm glad to hear you say this. I did not run away from you, but from slavery. It was not that I loved Caesar less, but Rome more."
There was discussion of the date of Frederick Douglass's birth, a question he was still trying to resolve. Captain Auld felt certain it had been February 1818. After spending 20 minutes together, Douglass wrote, "We parted to meet no more." Speaking before a racially mixed audience in a picnic grove outside of St. Michael's, during Douglass's speech, he said,
"We must not talk about equality until we can do what white people can do. As long as they can build vessels and we cannot, we are inferior. As long as they can found governments and we cannot, we are inferior."
17 months later, Douglass returned to the Eastern Shore and made pilgrimage to the site of his birth on Tuckahoe Creek. The occasion was a paid lecture sponsored by Talbot County Republicans. Douglass was given a suite in the town's finest hostelry, the Brick Hotel. He arrived on November 23, 1877, at Easton Point. After breakfast at the hotel and a stroll through Easton's streets, he spoke at the newly built Bethel AME Church, giving a lecture about hard work and saving their money. During the afternoon, he made a similar speech at the Ashbury United Methodist Church. His last visit to Talbot County was March 1893. In June 2011, the Frederick Douglass Honor Society, the town of Easton, and Talbot County unveiled a lifelike statue of Frederick Douglass, which proudly stands on the beautiful front lawn of the Talbot County Courthouse as a daily reminder that history lives within each of us.